They say the earth does not forget. We work upon the soil, we harvest its riches, and we bury our shames deep within its belly. We think the dust will keep our secrets. We are fools. In the village of Umu-Oma, the sun is a witness, and the wind is a messenger. For 20 years, we lived in a golden peace. Our barns were full of yam, our children grew tall, and our king sat upon a throne of ivory. But peace built on a lie is nothing but a house of sand waiting for the tide. The spirits are tired of silence. The great Iroko has begun to bleed, and the shadows are working in the light of day. A choice must be made, the crown or the truth, the king or the land. Listen closely, for when the born flute speaks, even the dead must answer. The sun did not merely set over the village of Umu-Oma, it surrendered. It hung low in the sky like a bruised orange, bleeding deep purples and fiery gold across the horizon. This was the hour of the spirits, the calm before the dark, when the boundary between the world of the living and the land of the ancestors grew as thin as a spider's silk. In the very heart of the village square stood the great Iroko. It was a titan of bark and leaf, a tree so ancient that the village elders claimed its roots didn't just hold the earth together, they reached down into the underworld to drink from the river of souls. Beneath this towering giant sat Obinna. While the other young men of Umu-Oma spent their days sharpening machetes or boasting of their wrestling matches in the dust-choked arenas, Obinna sought the company of the wind. He was lean, with muscles like coiled rope and eyes the color of polished obsidian, deep, reflective, and seemingly seeing things others missed. Across his lap lay his most prized possession, a flute. It wasn't made of common bamboo or wood. It was carved from the bleached thigh bone of a giant crane, etched with intricate woolly patterns that seemed to pulse when the light hit them just right. He lifted the instrument to his lips. The first note was a whisper, a soft invitation to the air. But as his fingers danced over the holes, the melody grew. It was a sound that defied the physical world. It mimicked the cry of a lonely mother, the rustle of dry palm fronds, and the heartbeat of the soil itself. The villagers, returning from their farms with baskets of yams balanced on their heads, would often stop in their tracks, paralyzed by the beauty of it. They said Obinna's music could make a stone weep and a hungry man forget his stomach. Yet, today, the music felt heavy. There was a jagged edge to the tune, a frantic vibration that made the birds in the upper branches of the Iroko fall silent. The air is changing, Obinna, a voice rasped. Obinna stopped playing, the silence that followed feeling like a physical weight. Standing nearby was Mazi Okoro, the oldest man in the village, leaning heavily on a staff adorned with eagle feathers. The old man's eyes were milky with cataracts, yet he stared directly at the great Iroko. The ancestors are not breathing with us today, Okoro whispered, his voice trembling like a dry leaf. They are holding their breath. Do you feel it, boy? The earth is shivering. Obinna looked around. He felt it. The usual evening sounds, the rhythmic thud of women pounding fufu in wooden mortars, the laughter of children chasing goats, the distant bleating of livestock, all of it had been sucked away into a vacuum. The wind, which usually carried the scent of wood smoke and roasting corn, had suddenly died. The heat of the sun was replaced by a sudden, unnatural chill that raised the hair on Obinna's arms. Suddenly, the great Iroko groaned. It wasn't the sound of wood bending in the wind, it was the sound of a giant waking from a centuries-long sleep. From the dense, impenetrable shadows behind the tree's massive trunk, a figure began to emerge. It didn't walk so much as it drifted, its feet barely brushing the red dust. It was a woman, a spirit masker, but unlike any the village had ever seen. Most masks were colorful, vibrant displays of cloth and raffia used for festivals. This one was draped in gray, rotten fibers that looked like they had been pulled from a grave. The mask itself was a terrifying visage of carved dark wood, with hollow eye sockets and a mouth frozen in a silent scream. A crowd began to gather at the edge of the square, huddled in terror. In Igbo tradition, the spirits were to be revered and feared, but this presence felt ancient, primal, and angry. Which house does this spirit belong to? A man whispered, his voice cracking. It belongs to no house. Mazi Okoro replied, his knees hitting the dirt in a sign of forced respect. It is the Agbara of the deep woods. It has not walked this earth since the great drought 50 years ago. The spirit didn't dance, it didn't utter the shrill, bird-like cries typical of the maskers. Instead, it moved with a chilling, mechanical grace toward the center of the square. It stopped 10 paces from Obinna. The young man stood his ground, his flute gripped tightly in his hand. He felt a strange resonance between the bone instrument and the spirit before him. It was as if they were made of the same essence. The spirit slowly raised a skeletal, ash-covered arm. It didn't point at the people, nor the elders, nor the shrines of the lesser gods. Its long, bony finger pointed directly toward the king's palace, a grand structure of red clay and polished wood that sat on the highest hill of Umu-Oma. At that moment, a low rumble started beneath their feet. It wasn't an earthquake, but a localized trembling. The great Iroko began to shed its leaves, thousands of them spiraling down like emerald rain, even though there was no breeze to blow them. And then came the omen that would change their lives forever. A thick, viscous liquid began to seep from the cracks in the Iroko's bark. It wasn't the clear sap of a healthy tree. It was deep, dark crimson. The tree is bleeding, a woman shrieked, clutching her children. The blood of the Iroko pooled at the roots, soaking into the dry earth. The spirit looked one last time at Obinna, its hollow eyes seeming to burn with an internal, ghostly fire. In a voice that sounded like grinding stones, it spoke a single word that echoed not in their ears, but in their very chests, Ezioku. The truth. With a sudden burst of movement, the spirit vanished back into the shadows of the forest, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and ancient dust. The villagers remained frozen, staring at the bleeding tree and then toward the palace where King Ezekwesili lived. Obinna looked down at his flute. The white bone was now stained with a single drop of the tree's blood. He knew that his days of playing for the wind were over. The land was crying out for a debt to be paid, and the melody required to settle that debt would be written in the blood of kings and the courage of the forgotten. The shadows were lengthening, and the true night of Umu-Oma was just beginning. The palace of King Ezekwesili was a fortress of red earth and ambition. It sat atop the highest hill in Umu-Oma, designed to overlook every compound, every farm, and every life within the village. To the common eye, it was a symbol of strength and divine favor. Its walls were smoothed with a mixture of clay and palm oil until they shone like copper in the sun, and the massive gates were carved from Iroko wood, depicting scenes of great harvests and defeated enemies. But inside, the air was different. It was heavy, stagnant, and smelled faintly of old iron and cold ash. King Ezekwesili sat upon his throne, a magnificent chair hewn from a single block of mahogany. His chest was draped in heavy strands of authentic coral beads, their deep orange-red hue signifying his absolute authority. His wrists were weighted down by solid ivory bangles, and a crown of eagle feathers rested upon his brow. To his subjects, he looked like a god in mortal skin. But as the king sat alone in the dim light of the evening, his hands were trembling. He clutched the armrests of his throne so hard his knuckles turned white. He was a man haunted by a ghost that had no name. 20 years ago, the village had been on the brink of collapse, the rains had failed, and a rival kingdom was sharpening its spears at the border. Then, almost overnight, the fortunes of Umu-Oma changed. The rains fell in abundance, the enemies retreated in fear, and Ezekwesili was crowned. The village celebrated it as a miracle. Only the king knew it was a transaction. The spirits do not forget, a voice whispered from the shadows of the throne room. Ezekwesili bolted upright, his hand instinctively flying to the hilt of the ceremonial bronze dagger at his hip. "Who is there?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the high, thatched rafters. Out of the gloom stepped Obinna. The young flute player looked small in the vastness of the hall, but he stood with a terrifying stillness. He was dusty from the village square, and in his hand, he gripped the bone flute. "You dare enter the inner chambers without a summons?" The king roared, though his voice lacked its usual iron. "I could have the guards take your head for this insolence." "The guards are currently staring at the great Iroko, Igwe," Obinna said calmly. "They are watching the tree bleed. They are watching the earth drink what it should have never tasted. I think, perhaps, they have forgotten their duties to a mortal king." Ezekwesili felt a cold spike of fear pierce his heart. "What nonsense do you speak? Bleeding trees, you have been chewing too much kola nut, boy. Leave now, before I lose my patience." Obinna took a step forward, the flickering oil lamps casting long, distorted shadows behind him. "The Agbara has returned, Igwe." It pointed its finger at this palace. It spoke of the truth. "My flute, it wouldn't play the songs of the harvest today. It only played a dirge, a funeral song for a man who died 20 years ago but was never buried." The king's face turned the color of ash. The secret he had buried in the darkest corner of his soul, the night he led his own brother, the rightful heir, into the forbidden forest and returned alone, was clawing at the walls of his mind. He had told the village his brother had been taken by a leopard. He had built his throne on a foundation of bone and silence. "Silence!" the king screamed, standing up. "I am the lion of this land. I have brought wealth. I have brought peace." As the king stood, a soft drip 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 echoed through the hall. At first, Ezekwesili thought it was a leak in the thatch. But as he looked up, he saw the ceiling was dry. He looked down at his feet. A single drop of dark, crimson liquid had landed on his royal foot, staining the pale skin between his sandal straps. Then another drop fell, hitting his ivory bangle. He wiped it away frantically, but it smeared, A streak of thick, warm blood that smelled of ancient sap and stagnant water. The king looked at the walls. The red clay was weeping. Tears of blood were trickling down the carved pillars, trailing through the depictions of his ancestors. It was as if the palace itself was bleeding out, hemorrhaging the secrets it had kept for 2 decades. The land is rejecting you, Igwe, Obinna whispered, his eyes fixed on the king's stern hands. You cannot rule a people when the very soil beneath their feet is screaming for justice. The great Iroko has opened its mouth, and it will not close until the debt is paid. Ezekwesili lunged forward, grabbing Obinna by the throat. The king's strength was desperate, the strength of a drowning man. You will not speak of this. You will go to the village square and tell them it is a sign of blessing. You will play your flute and drown out the whispers, or I will ensure you never breathe another note. Obinna didn't struggle. He looked into the king's eyes with a pity that burned hotter than anger. My music is not mine anymore, Igwe. It belongs to the Ani, the earth goddess, and she is very, very hungry. Outside, the sky turned a bruised, unnatural black. A wind began to howl through the palace corridors, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the faint, ghostly sound of 1,000 flutes playing in unison. It was the sound of the ancestors rising. The king shoved Obinna away, stumbling back toward his throne. He looked at his hands, the blood wouldn't wipe off. It seemed to be sinking into his skin, marking him. He realized then that the physical walls of his palace could not protect him from a spirit that worked through the conscience. Guards, the king cried out, but his voice was drowned by a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the hill. In the doorway, a shadow appeared. It wasn't a guard, it was Adana, the king's only daughter. She stood there, her face a mask of horror and dawning realization. She had heard the king's confession in his panic. She had seen the bleeding walls. Her eyes met Obinna's, and in that moment, an alliance was born, not of politics, but of survival. Father, she said, her voice trembling, what have you done? The king looked from his daughter to the flute player, and then to the blood pooling around his throne. The secret was out, and the truth was coming to collect its due. The morning that followed the king's outburst did not bring the sun. Instead, a thick, milky mist clung to the forest floor, a shroud that refused to lift. The village of Umu-Oma was a ghost of itself. The markets were silent, and the smell of rot had begun to drift from the yam barns. The blight had arrived. In a single night, the prize crops had turned into black, weeping mush. Obinna stood at the edge of the forbidden forest, the evil grove, where the discarded and the cursed were said to linger. He adjusted the strap of his leather satchel, feeling the weight of the bone flute against his ribs. He expected to walk this path alone. No sane man or woman stepped into the cave of 7 sighs, for it was said that the cave did not just echo your voice, it echoed your regrets. You move like a man who wants to die, a sharp voice called out. Obinna turned to see Adana stepping through the fog. She had traded her royal silk wrappers for a practical hunting tunic of dyed indigo. In her hand was a spear tipped with blackened iron, and her eyes, though red from a night of weeping, were as sharp as the blade she carried. This isn't a stroll through the palace gardens, Princess, Obinna said, his voice low. Your father's guards are looking for me. If they find you with me, they will call it treason. My father is a man I no longer recognize, Adina replied, stepping past him into the dense foliage. The land is dying because of his shadow. If your music is the light, then I will be the shield that carries it. They plunged into the jungle. Giant ferns brushed against their legs like reaching hands, and the canopy above was so thick that the day was reduced to a permanent twilight. The sounds were overwhelming, the rhythmic clack-clack of woodpeckers, the distant, territorial roar of a silverback gorilla, and the unsettling whoop of hyenas that shouldn't have been active in the daylight. As they pushed deeper, the flora began to change. The trees grew twisted, their bark covered in a glowing, bioluminescent fungus that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. This was the territory of the old gods. Do you hear that? Adina whispered, leveling her spear. I hear nothing, Obinna whispered back. Exactly. The forest had gone too silent. Even the wind had ceased to rustle the leaves. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shift. It wasn't earth, but a carpet of millions of soldier ants, moving in a synchronized wave. They weren't attacking, they were fleeing. Something was coming. From the canopy above, a creature descended, not a spirit, but a guardian. A python, thicker than a man's torso and colored like ancient bronze, uncoiled from a branch. Its eyes were not the slitted pupils of a predator, but wide and milky, like the eyes of Mazi Okoro. It blocked their path, its tongue flickering in the damp air. Obinna didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for his flute. He played a sequence of low, vibrating notes that mimicked the hum of the earth. The sound seemed to soothe the great serpent. It bowed its massive head, allowing them to pass. Adina watched in awe. How did you know? She asked. The flute doesn't see a monster, Obinna explained. It sees a hungry soul. Everything in this forest is just looking for a reason to let us through. By midday, they reached the mouth of the Cave of Seven Sighs. The entrance was shaped like a gaping mouth, and from its depths, a constant, low whistling sound emerged, the wind rushing through the limestone teeth of the earth. It sounded like a collective moan of 1,000 ancestors. The interior was a labyrinth of stalactites and hidden pools of crystal clear water. As they worked, their footsteps echoed, but the echoes didn't match their movements. When Obinna stepped, the echo sounded like a drum. When Adina stepped, it sounded like the clinking of chains. In the deepest chamber, they found the oracle. She was not a giant or a specter. She was a tiny, withered woman sitting by a small fire that burned with a green flame. She was weaving a basket out of what looked like human hair. She did not look up as they approached. The king's daughter and the bone player, she cackled, her voice like dry parchment rubbing together. You bring the scent of blood and music into my home. Why? The land is dying, Adina said, stepping forward. We seek the song of restoration. The oracle finally looked up. Her face was a mark of 1,000 years of Igbo history. She looked at Obinna's flute and then at the drop of Iroko blood that still stained its tip. The song you seek is not written in the air, the oracle said. It is written in the blood. To heal the land of Umu-Oma, the truth must be shouted from the highest peak. But the earth goddess, Annie, is a merchant. She does not give for free. For the king's light to be raised.
Sebulu wabia keneli bia nulu ya elo na mona bwana ma udigili demu Ibo neno kemamu Ibo neno kemamu Kenenu wanta tebu naka Na malu nyojo digili Kenenu wanta tebu naka Na malu nyojo digili Kenenu nyabu kenwa tukugu La gozion idata notan south mou Bedika mulo nye nego biagene Odigili ni okemau Hai chifu somto chugu Imade soka muna mona ma Kedani wata malunga da buelu chievi Amulo nye nego Amulo nye nego biagene liyo negligili mau Kolobio yibo bi anulonu
your futures for a village that might stone you for the truth. Very well, take the knowledge. But know this, on the night of the full moon, when you play, the king will not be your only enemy. The shadows of the men he killed will rise to hear the music, and they are not as forgiving as the living. She handed Obinna a small, black seed. Swallow this, it will turn your blood into a bridge. But once the song starts, you cannot stop. If the melody breaks before the moon reaches its zenith, you will both be consumed by the earth. As they left the cave, they had the weapon, they sung, but the price of victory was now etched into their hearts. The trek back from the Cave of Seven Sighs was no longer a journey, it was a race against a closing trap. The air in the forest had grown thick and claustrophobic, smelling of ozone and wet iron. The blight was spreading faster than the oracle had predicted. As Obinna and Adana moved through the undergrowth, they saw the evidence of the land's agony. The massive ferns were calling into blackened husks, and the very soil seemed to groan beneath their feet. "We are being hunted," Adana whispered, her hand tightening around the shaft of her iron-tipped spear. She didn't look back, but her ears, trained by years of listening to the palace's whispered politics, caught the rhythmic snap of twigs that didn't belong to any animal. "The king's men," Obinna replied, his voice a low rasp. He felt the black seed the oracle had given him sitting heavy in his stomach, a cold coal of potential energy. "Your father knows that if we reach the village square by the full moon, his crown becomes a noose." They reached the banks of the Obinna stream, a place usually known for its serenity and the sparkling clarity of its waters. But today, the water was a turbulent, muddy brown, churning as if something massive was thrashing beneath the surface. The only way across was a series of sleek, jagged limestone boulders that formed a natural, treacherous bridge. "Stop!" a voice thundered from the tree line behind them. Out of the foliage emerged Okeke, the captain of the king's guard. He was a mountain of a man, his chest scarred from a dozen border wars, his eyes filled with a grim, reluctant duty. Behind him stood 6 warriors, their bronze machetes catching the filtered light of the canopy. "Princess," Okeke said, his voice echoing over the roar of the water. "Step away from the boy. The king has declared him a sorcerer who has poisoned the Iroko. I have orders to bring his heart, and the bone he carries, back to the palace." Adina stepped in front of Obinna, her spear leveled at the captain's throat. "You know the truth, Okeke. You were there 20 years ago. You saw my uncle go into the woods and only my father return. You are guarding a throne built on a grave." Okeke's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, a shadow of guilt, but he hardened his gaze. I am a soldier of the crown, not a judge of the past. Move, Obinna, or I will have to forget who your father is. Then forget, Obinna hissed. Okeke roared, charging forward with a heavy swinging blow of his machete. Obinna met him with a grace that was almost like a dance, using the length of her spear to keep the giant at bay. The sound of steel clashing against iron rang out over the rushing water, a metallic rhythm that punctuated the chaos. Obinna backed toward the stream, his hand going to his flute. Two guards launched at him, their blades whistling through the humid air. In a normal world, Obinna would have been cut down in seconds. But he wasn't a normal man anymore. He swallowed the last of the oracle's black seed and blew a sharp, staccato note into the flute. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The sound didn't travel through the air, it traveled through the ground. The earth beneath the guards' feet buckled. A shockwave of pure sonic energy slammed into their chests, throwing them backward into the churning mud. The boy is using witchcraft. One of the guards screamed, scrambling to his feet. It is not witchcraft, Obinna shouted, his voice vibrating with an unnatural power. It is the voice of the land you are trampling. Obinna was a blur of indigo and steel. She spun her spear, parrying a blow from Okeke and delivering a stinging kick to his knee. But the guards were closing in. One of them, a man with a scarred face, saw an opening. He didn't go for Obinna, he aimed a heavy throwing knife at the bone flute. The blade whistled through the air. Obinna saw it in slow motion, the spinning metal, the glint of the sun, the trajectory of destruction. He turned his body, shielding the instrument with his own ribs. The knife buried itself deep into his shoulder. Obinna gasped, the world spinning. He fell back against a mossy boulder at the water's edge. The blood that leaked from his wound was a strange, shimmering violet, the mark of the oracle's seed. Obinna, Obinna cried out, momentarily distracted. Okeke seized the opportunity, his heavy fist crashing into Obinna's jaw. She fell into the shallow water, her spear clattering away. The captain stood over her, his machete raised. It didn't have to be this way, princess. Obinna, clutching his bleeding shoulder, looked at the bone flute. It was stained with his own blood now, mixing with the sap of the Iroko. He realized the oracle's words, the song costs breath. He didn't wait for the full moon. He put the flute to his lips and played a single, agonizingly beautiful chord. The stream responded. The water of the Obinna rose up like a living wall, a liquid serpent of brown and white foam. It didn't drown the guards, it simply picked them up and deposited them 20 yards back into the jungle, tangled in the vines and thorns. The water then formed a bridge of solid mist, stretching toward the village. Obinna looked at Obinna, who was coughing up river water, her eyes wide with terror and wonder. He reached out a hand, his face pale from blood loss. The song has started, Obinna whispered, his voice already beginning to fade, becoming a mere echo. I can feel the ancestors waking up. If we don't reach the square now, the water won't be the only thing that rises. They scrambled across the bridge of mist just as it dissolved back into the stream. Behind them, Okeke and his men watched in a stunned, religious silence. They didn't pursue. They knew that they were no longer fighting a boy and a princess, they were fighting the very spirit of Great Igbo land. As they emerged from the forest and saw the village of Umu-Oma in the distance, the sun was finally dipping below the horizon. The first sliver of the full moon was beginning to peek through the clouds like a silver eye. The village was lit by 1,000 torches, but they weren't the lights of a festival. They were the lights of a people waiting for a miracle or an execution. Obinna stumbled, his vision blaring. I can't feel my breath, Adanna. She caught him, pulling his arm over her shoulder. Then take mine, we are almost there. The king is waiting, and so is the truth. The drums of Umu-Oma began to beat, not for the king, but for the end of his world. The village square of Umu-Oma had become a theater of the divine. Thousands of torches flickered in the hands of the villagers, their orange flames dancing in the eyes of men, women, and children who stood in a terrifying, expectant silence. In the center of the square, the great Iroko tree stood like a silent judge, its bark still whipping that thick, crimson sap. But now, the tree was humming. A low-frequency vibration rattled the teeth of everyone present, a sound that felt like the earth itself was clearing its throat to speak. King Ezekwesili stood on the royal dais, his back rigid, his face a mask of crumbling stone. He wore his full ceremonial regalia, the leopard skin, the heavy coral, the ivory, but it no longer looked like finery. It looked like a shroud. Beside him stood the village priests, their bodies painted in white chalk, their eyes darting nervously toward the forest. Then, they appeared. Out of the darkness of the trail emerged two figures. Adanna, the princess, was covered in the mud of the Ogbunike stream, her indigo tunic torn, her face bruised but her head held higher than any queen's. Supporting her was Obinna. He was a ghost of a man, his skin ashen, his shoulders soaked in that strange, shimmering violet blood. In his hand, he clutched the bone flute as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the living world. Blasphemers! The king's voice cracked across the square, desperate and shrill. They have brought the blight. They have caused our sacred tree. Guards, seize them and cast them into the fire. But the guards did not move. They looked at the Iroko, then at the moon, which had finally reached its zenith, a massive silver coin pinned to the velvet sky. The silence of the people was a wall that the king's words could not breach. Obinna stepped away from Adanna. Each movement cost him an ocean of effort. He walked to the very roots of the Iroko, stepping into the pool of the tree's blood. He looked up at the king, and for a moment, the two men locked eyes. In the king's eyes, there was the frantic scurrying of a cornered rat. In Obinna's, there was the vast, calm horizon of the sea. Obinna raised the bone flute. He didn't just play, he vanished into the music. The first note was not a sound, but a feeling, a sudden, sharp intake of breath that made every person in the square gasp simultaneously. As the melody unfolded, the mist rising from the ground started to thicken, spinning into shapes. The Song of the Seven Sighs was manifesting as visual memories in the air. The villagers cried out as they saw a ghostly recreation of the forest 20 years ago. They saw a younger Ezekwesili walking alongside his brother, the noble Prince Ikena. They saw the flash of a blade in the moonlight. They saw the king's brother fall, not to a leopard, but to a sibling's greed. They saw the king bury the body beneath the sapling of the very Iroko they stood under today. Lies, sorcery, Ezekwesili screamed, clutching his ears, but the music was inside him now. It was vibrating in his bones, pulling the secret out of his marrow. As the sun reached its crescendo, the ground began to heave. The roots of the great Iroko burst through the surface like giant wooden serpents. They didn't attack the villagers, they wound themselves around the royal dais. The wood of the king's throne began to sprout thorns, pinning him in place. Obinna's body began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. The violet blood from his wound flowed into the flute, turning the white bone into a translucent amethyst. He was pouring his very life force, his breath, into the instrument. His eyes turned entirely white, reflecting the full moon above. The date is called. The oracle's voice echoed through the square, though she was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trunk of the Iroko itself. It was the ghost of Ikenna, the murdered brother, formed from the crimson sap and the silver moonlight. He didn't look like a monster, he looked like justice. He walked toward the throne. Exequatory let out a final, soul-shattering cry of, "Forgive me." But the words were swallowed by the final, piercing note of Obinna's flute. In a flash of blinding white light, the king, the ghost, and the thorns vanished. The royal dais was empty. The heavy coral beads that had belonged to the king lay shattered on the ground, rolling in the dust like abandoned seeds. The music stopped. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing the village had ever heard. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of a fever breaking. Obinna collapsed, the bone flute falling from his nerveless fingers. It shattered into 1,000 pieces of stardust as it hit the ground. Adina rushed to him, cradling his head. "Obinna, speak to me." Obinna's eyes returned to their natural obsidian. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The price had been paid. He had given his voice to the land so the land could find its own. He smiled at her, a weary, peaceful smile, and pointed toward the fields. Under the moonlight, the black, rotten yams were turning green. The shriveled leaves of the palm trees were unfurling, drinking the midnight dew. The blight was gone. The earth was satisfied. The village elders approached, led by Mazi Okoro. They didn't look at the empty throne. They looked at the young man who could no longer speak and the princess who had chosen her people over her blood. "The king is gone," Okoro announced, his voice steady for the first time in years. "The shadow has lifted, but we have no crown." Adina stood up, wiping the mud from her face. "The time of crowns but with blood is over. We will lead together, as a cycle, not a spear." The sun begins to rise, a true, golden sun that warms the rejuvenated fields of Umu-Oma. The villagers are beginning to sing, not a dirge, but a new song they learned from the echoes of the flute. Obinna stands at the edge of the square, watching the sunrise. He is silent, but the wind carries his melody through the leaves of the Iroko, a permanent reminder that the truth can never be buried deep enough to stay hidden. Truth is life. If you felt the power of the silent flute, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. Tell us in the comments, what secret do you think the great Iroko is still hiding? Until the next story, stay grounded in the truth.